All right, let's take another deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring Indigenous people's rights in the Philippines. You sent in some really interesting stuff for this one. We've got the Indigenous Navigator report, a bunch of articles, and even some data points. And it's a complicated topic, right? But we're going to break it all down. We'll pull out the most interesting and important information so you can walk away feeling like an expert.
Sounds good.
So joining us today is, well, you. And you're an expert in human rights and development, especially when it comes to indigenous communities.
That's right.
Now, here's something that might surprise you. The Philippines actually has one of the most progressive laws in the world for protecting indigenous rights. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, passed back in 1997. But, laws are one thing, reality is another. So how does that actually play out for the nearly 10 million indigenous peoples in the Philippines today? I guess that's what we're here to find out.
Let's dive in.
Perfect. So, first things first, who are we even talking about when we say indigenous peoples in the Philippines?
Well, it's definitely not a single group. The 2020 census actually included ethnicity data for the first time ever, and it showed that indigenous peoples make up a pretty significant portion of the population, 9.1% of Filipino households, to be exact. So we're talking about groups like the Subanan, Manobo, Mandaya, and so many others, and they're spread out across different regions. It's interesting, though, the Baikal region was actually the most homogenous, with almost 80% identifying as Bicolano.
Wow, that's a lot of diversity. So let's get into IPRA. On paper, it sounds fantastic, this law for protecting their rights. But is it really living up to its potential?
That's where things get a little tricky. IPRA is kind of, I guess you could say it's a double-edged sword. It has the potential to really empower indigenous communities, but it can also be used against them.
Hold on. How can a law that's supposed to protect a group actually be used against them? That seems a bit counterintuitive, don't you think?
It all comes down to implementation. So IPRA, in theory, it recognizes things like ancestral domains, self-governance, cultural integrity, social justice, and basic human rights. But, putting those ideas into practice, especially in a place as complex as the Philippines, well, that's a whole other story.
So even with IPRA in place, indigenous peoples are still facing an uphill battle when it comes to their rights.
Yeah, exactly. You have these power imbalances, political patronage, and even other national laws that often directly clash with the whole point of IPRA. And that can really undermine its effectiveness.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's look at a specific example, land rights. The report, the Indigenous Navigator report, it points out that 16 million hectares of ancestral land have actually been titled under IPRA. Now that sounds like progress, right?
It is, to an extent, but it's important to, I guess, zoom out and see the bigger picture, because indigenous peoples are still being displaced from their lands. And it's due to things like land grabbing, mining operations, agribusiness expanding, dams being built, and illegal logging. These activities are often driven by laws that contradict IPRA, making it difficult for indigenous peoples to really benefit from the land that's rightfully theirs.
So it's kind of a one step forward, two steps back situation.
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay. So what about the international community? How do they view the Philippines' record on indigenous people's rights?
Well, they have taken some positive steps on the world stage, I'll give them that. They've ratified various human rights treaties, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that's the UNDRIP, and they even actively participate in those UN reviews of their human rights record.
Okay, so that sounds promising. Are there any specific concerns that have been raised, though?
Yeah, even with all that, there are definitely some concerns that have been flagged by UN committees. A big one is the lack of consistent respect for what's called free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC for short.
FPIC, could you maybe break that down a bit? What is that exactly, and why is it so important, especially for indigenous peoples?
Sure. So FPIC is basically the right of indigenous peoples to give or withhold their consent to any project that affects their lands or resources. It's not just a formality like signing a form. It means they need to be genuinely informed about the project, they need to understand the potential impacts, and there needs to be a balance of power, between the indigenous communities and whoever's proposing the project. And unfortunately, the Philippines often fall short of this, especially when it comes to projects on indigenous territories.
So it's about making sure that indigenous peoples have a real say in what happens on their land.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Another concern is the lack of what we call disaggregated data.
Disaggregated data.
Yeah, so basically, without data broken down by ethnicity, it's really hard to track progress on issues that are specific to indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
Which then makes it difficult to, design programs that are actually effective or understand their unique challenges.
So the lack of specific data makes it even harder to create policies that actually help these communities.
Exactly. And it also makes it harder to hold the government accountable for fulfilling its obligations to indigenous peoples.
Right. That makes sense. Okay, so let's dive into some specific laws and policies in the Philippines that seem to contradict IPRA and threaten indigenous peoples' rights, even though it exists.
All right, so one of the most controversial ones is the Philippine Mining Act of 1995. This act has been widely criticized for leading to the displacement of indigenous peoples from their lands and causing a lot of environmental damage in their territories.
And hasn't the situation gotten worse recently?
Yeah, unfortunately, the recent lifting of the moratorium on new mining applications has really heightened those fears of further encroachment on indigenous lands and environmental degradation. It often feels like economic interests are being put ahead of the rights and well-being of indigenous peoples.
That's definitely a pattern we see in many parts of the world. Are there other policies that are causing similar conflicts?
Oh yeah, definitely. Another example is the National Integrated Protected Areas System Act of 1992. It's called NIPIS for short. This act, while it's meant to protect biodiversity, has actually led to the displacement of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands.
Wait, so protecting nature is pushing indigenous peoples off their land? That seems backwards. I mean, shouldn't protecting nature be good for everyone, especially indigenous communities who often have such a strong connection to the land? Where's the disconnect?
It's about, well, the way these protected areas are established and managed. Indigenous communities are often excluded from the decision-making process, and the restrictions imposed on land use within those protected areas, they can disrupt their traditional practices, their livelihoods.
So another case of good intentions not actually leading to good outcomes for indigenous peoples. It's like they're stuck in this web of conflicting laws and policies.
Yeah, and then to make things even more confusing, there's the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law, CRRL. It promotes individual land ownership, which clashes with IPRA's recognition of collective land rights.
Yeah.
So it creates this confusion and sometimes even division within indigenous communities.
So they're in this double bind. Laws that are meant to protect them actually end up conflicting with other policies, putting them in a very vulnerable position.
Exactly. It's a very challenging situation. And it highlights the need for a more holistic approach to law and policy, something that actually protects the rights and interests of indigenous peoples in a consistent way.
It sounds like a huge task, but definitely a necessary one if things are going to change. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about IPRA's provision for self-governance, the recognition of indigenous political systems. How's that playing out in reality?
Well, the reality on the ground is quite different from what IPRA says. A lot of indigenous organizations and leaders face constant harassment and intimidation. They're often accused of being, communist fronts or terrorist groups.
That's awful. Where is this intimidation coming from?
Sadly, it's often coming from state forces. It creates a real climate of fear, which makes it almost impossible for indigenous communities to exercise their right to self-governance.
It seems like a deliberate attempt to silence them and prevent them from participating in political processes.
And this has been made even worse by the 2020 anti-terrorism law. The language in the law is very vague, which means it can be used to target indigenous leaders and basically suppress any dissent.
So instead of creating an environment where they can exercise their right to self-determination, it's the opposite. They're facing more scrutiny and suppression.
Exactly. And this climate of fear has a chilling effect on their ability to advocate for their rights and really participate in decisions that directly affect their lives.
Okay. Let's move on to cultural preservation, another core element of IPRA. How are indigenous peoples doing when it comes to protecting their languages, their traditions, and their heritage in the Philippines?
I'd say it's a mixed bag. There have been some positive developments, like initially including mother tongue education in the K-12 curriculum, but we've also seen some setbacks.
Setbacks like what?
Well, the recent decision by the Marcos administration to abolish mother tongue education was a big one.
Wow, that's a huge step backwards. What does that mean for indigenous communities?
Well, a lot of indigenous languages are already considered endangered, and without real effort to support them and revitalize them, they could disappear completely. Language is so much more than just a way to communicate. It's tied to culture, identity, and traditional knowledge. Losing a language is like losing a whole world of knowledge and understanding.
It feels like a loss for everyone, not just indigenous communities. It's a loss for the Philippines as a whole. Are there other issues within cultural preservation that are worrying?
Definitely. One thing that needs attention is the lack of a clear policy for repatriating indigenous artifacts that are being held in museums outside of the Philippines. A lot of these were taken during the colonial period, and they're a really important part of indigenous cultural heritage.
Yeah, that's a common problem for indigenous peoples all over the world. Getting those artifacts back isn't just about the objects themselves, it's about acknowledging historical injustice, recognizing how important these items are to the cultural identity and spiritual well-being of indigenous communities.
It's about healing, healing the wounds of the past
Mhm.
and rebuilding trust. While some progress has been made through private initiatives, there needs to be a more comprehensive government-led effort to systematically address the return of these stolen cultural treasures.
It sounds like there's a lot more work to be done to make sure that indigenous peoples have control over their cultural heritage. It's a constant struggle.
All right, well, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about social justice. Despite IPRA's guarantees, are indigenous peoples in the Philippines actually experiencing a just and equitable society?
Unfortunately, that's where the gap between what the law says and what's actually happening is the widest. Despite IPRA, indigenous people still face systemic marginalization and social injustice.
Can you give us an idea of what that looks like in everyday life?
The data paints a pretty stark picture. Indigenous peoples are disproportionately represented among the poorest in the Philippines, and they face huge barriers when it comes to accessing basic services, things like healthcare, education, clean water, even electricity.
It's like a cycle of poverty and marginalization that's almost impossible to break free from. And the report, the Indigenous Navigator report, it actually paints an even more disturbing picture when it comes to human rights violations. It does. The report reveals an alarming number of human rights violations against indigenous peoples between 2016 and 2021. We're talking about extrajudicial killings, illegal arrests, forced displacement. It's a very serious situation.
It is. What factors contribute to an environment where such violations can happen so openly?
Well, it's a combination of things. You have the systemic marginalization of indigenous peoples, which makes them more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Then there's the lack of law enforcement in remote areas, which creates this sense of impunity for perpetrators. And then you have the ongoing conflict between the government and armed groups in some regions. Indigenous communities often get caught in the crossfire.
So it's a multifaceted problem with deep roots. It seems like so much more needs to be done to ensure that indigenous peoples in the Philippines are not only protected by the law, but can actually live with dignity, security, and the freedom to exercise their rights without fear.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue that requires a multifaceted solution. Addressing poverty, improving access to services, strengthening law enforcement, promoting peace building, and, most importantly, tackling the underlying discrimination and prejudice.
It's a tall order, but a necessary one. Now, before we move on to potential solutions in part two of our deep dive, I want to acknowledge that the Philippine government does have programs in place that are aimed at improving the lives of indigenous peoples. Can you tell us about some of these programs and their impact?
Sure. One well-known program is the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program, or 4Ps as it's often called. It's a conditional cash transfer program that provides financial help to the poorest families, and a lot of the beneficiaries are indigenous households.
So, what kind of impact has 4Ps had on indigenous communities?
It's been a bit of a mixed bag. On the plus side, 4Ps has helped improve school attendance and access to health care for children in those communities. But some people argue that the conditional nature of the program, requiring families to meet certain requirements like school attendance and health checkups, can create extra burdens for families that are already struggling.
So, finding that balance between providing support and ensuring accountability is crucial. But maybe even more important is addressing the root causes of poverty rather than just the symptoms.
Exactly. And sometimes the program's implementation doesn't take into account the specific challenges faced by indigenous communities, like being in remote areas, cultural barriers, or lack of access to information.
So it's not just about giving money, it's about making sure the program is designed and implemented in a way that is sensitive to the specific needs of indigenous communities.
Exactly. Another program is Kalahi Seeds, which stands for Kapit Bisig Laban sa Kairapan Comprehensive and Integrated Delivery of Social Services. It's a mouthful, I know. But it uses a community-driven development approach, meaning communities have more control over projects in their area.
What makes Kalahi Seeds different from other programs?
It's different because of its bottom-up approach. Communities can identify their own needs, decide what projects are most important, and manage resources themselves. This has been really good for Indigenous communities because it allows them to shape development initiatives in a way that aligns with their values and traditional knowledge.
So it's not just about providing services, it's about giving communities the power to take charge of their own development. Are there any downsides to this approach?
The community-driven model is great, but it does depend on the capacity of local communities to manage those projects. If communities don't have the skills or resources they need, it can lead to challenges in implementation and sustainability.
So, providing enough training and support is key to making sure these communities can manage these projects successfully and that the benefits last.
Absolutely.
Okay, now let's talk about a program that's been more controversial, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or NTF-ELCAC. It aims to reduce poverty, but it's been criticized a lot for its militaristic approach.
Yeah, NTF-ELCAC is definitely a complex issue. On the one hand, it tries to address poverty and underdevelopment in areas affected by conflict, a lot of which are home to Indigenous communities. It's responsible for things like building infrastructure, providing social services, and promoting livelihood opportunities.
So on the surface, it seems like it's trying to do good. What are the concerns about it then?
The biggest concern is its heavy-handed tactics. It blurs the lines between development and counterinsurgency efforts. NTF-ELCAC has been accused of red tagging, which is basically labeling individuals and organizations as communist rebels or sympathizers, often without real evidence.
And we already talked about how damaging red tagging can be for Indigenous peoples and their advocates. It creates fear and shuts down any opposing voices.
Exactly. This approach makes it really difficult for Indigenous communities to freely express their concerns and participate in development initiatives without fearing they'll face consequences.
It doesn't seem like a very effective way to address poverty and conflict if it creates even more division and mistrust.
It raises a really important question. How do you balance security concerns with protecting human rights, especially in places where Indigenous communities are already marginalized and vulnerable?
It highlights the need for a more thoughtful approach to peace building and development, one that prioritizes dialogue, respect for human rights, and meaningful participation from everyone involved, including Indigenous peoples.
Right. It's about recognizing that you can't achieve sustainable peace and development through force or coercion. It has to come from building trust, addressing the root causes of conflict, and creating opportunities for everyone in society to thrive.
It's a complicated and challenging task, but it's essential for a just and equitable future for everyone in the Philippines, including Indigenous peoples. We'll be diving deeper into potential solutions in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, I'd like you to think about what we've discussed. What are your thoughts on all the complexities surrounding Indigenous peoples' rights in the Philippines?
Take some time to consider how these issues are connected to bigger themes like social justice, environmental sustainability, and human rights. We'll pick up the conversation in part 2, where we'll explore some inspiring initiatives and discuss some concrete ways to create a more just and equitable future for Indigenous peoples in the Philippines.
Until then, keep diving deep.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Indigenous peoples' rights in the Philippines. In the last part, we went through the historical context, the legal framework, and some of the ongoing challenges that these communities face. Now, I think it's time to shift our focus a bit and talk about potential solutions. Let's envision a more just and equitable future for Indigenous peoples in the Philippines.
Absolutely. We spent a lot of time unpacking the complexities, and it's pretty clear that achieving meaningful change requires a multifaceted approach. We need to move beyond just acknowledging the problems and start exploring tangible solutions.
Right. And I think a good place to start is understanding that there's no, magic bullet solution. Indigenous communities in the Philippines are so diverse, each with their own unique histories, cultural practices, and challenges. Any solution that actually works needs to be tailored to their specific needs and aspirations.
I completely agree. A top-down, one-size-fits-all approach often misses the nuances of local contexts and can even make existing power imbalances worse. What we need are solutions that actually empower Indigenous communities to take control of their own destinies.
Exactly. And that brings us to self-determination and Indigenous-led initiatives. Instead of imposing solutions from the outside, we need to support and amplify the voices of Indigenous peoples themselves.
I'm really interested to hear more about that. Can you give us some examples of Indigenous-led initiatives that are already making a difference in the Philippines?
Sure. One really inspiring example is the Timuy Justice and Governance System, or TJGS, among the Tidore and Lambangian peoples in Mindanao. This system is based on their traditional laws and practices, but they've adapted it to address contemporary issues, things like conflict resolution, land management, and human rights protection.
So it's a blend of traditional wisdom and modern approaches. How does the TJGS actually work in practice?
So the TJGS works through a council of elders called the Timway. They're respected leaders within the community. They help facilitate dialogue, mediate disputes, and make decisions based on customary law and, principles of consensus building.
It sounds like a very community-centered approach to governance. What kind of impact has the TJGS had on the Tetere and Lambangan communities?
The TJGS has been really effective, especially in resolving conflicts, particularly land disputes. Those can be a big source of tension in indigenous communities. It's also played a key role in promoting peace building and reconciliation in a region that's experienced a lot of conflict.
It's incredible how indigenous communities are drawing on their own knowledge and traditions to create systems of governance that are both effective and culturally relevant.
It really speaks to their resilience and ability to adapt. Another impressive initiative is the Cordillera People's Alliance, or CPA, up in the northern Philippines. The CPA has been leading a lot of campaigns to protect indigenous lands and resources, especially when it comes to those big mining projects we talked about.
We did talk about the negative impacts of mining on indigenous communities earlier. How has the CPA been tackling this issue?
Well, the CPA has this multi-pronged strategy. They combine grassroots organizing, legal advocacy, and public awareness campaigns. They've actually been very successful in mobilizing indigenous communities and allies to resist those destructive mining projects. They've also been instrumental in advocating for policy changes that recognize indigenous people's right to free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC.
Speaking of FPIC, we talked about how the lack of respect for FPIC is a major issue in the Philippines. What are some things that can be done to strengthen FPIC and make sure indigenous communities have a real voice in decisions that affect their lands and resources?
Strengthening FPIC really requires a shift in power dynamics. It's not just about, going through the motions and checking boxes. It's about a genuine process of engagement where indigenous communities are treated as equal partners in development.
Can you paint a picture of what that would actually look like?
Okay, so first of all, indigenous communities need access to information. They need to be told about the proposed projects, what the potential impacts might be, and what the alternatives are. And this information needs to be given to them in a way they understand, using language and formats that are accessible to them.
It's about transparency and accessibility. What else is important for meaningful FPIC?
The second thing is that indigenous communities need to be able to understand the potential impacts of these projects. That means providing them with the technical expertise, legal support, and resources to conduct their own independent assessments.
So it's not just about informing them, it's about giving them the power to make decisions based on their own understanding and analysis.
Exactly. And then finally, they need the power to negotiate. They
Yeah.
need to be able to say no to projects they believe are harmful or simply unacceptable.
So it's about moving from just consultation to genuine collaboration. Indigenous communities need to have a seat at the table, a real voice in shaping those development projects.
Yes, and ultimately it's about respecting their right to self-determination.
Okay, so let's switch gears again and talk about legal and policy reforms. We've discussed how certain laws, like the Philippine Mining Act and the NIPAS Act, often clash with IPRA and actually undermine indigenous people's rights. What can be done to address this? It seems like a complicated legal web.
It is, and that's why a comprehensive review and reform of these conflicting laws is absolutely crucial. We need to make sure that all laws and policies are in line with the spirit of IPRA and that they prioritize the rights and well-being of indigenous peoples.
That sounds like a huge undertaking. Where would you even begin? What are some of the key areas that need to be addressed?
One important area is clarifying the overlapping mandates of different government agencies. You often have multiple agencies with conflicting jurisdictions over indigenous lands and resources. This lack of clarity creates confusion, creates unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles, and sometimes even puts indigenous communities in the middle of competing interests.
So it's about streamlining the bureaucracy and making sure there's a clear framework for protecting indigenous people's rights.
Right. Another crucial area is strengthening the enforcement of IPRA. The National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, the NCIP, they're the ones tasked with implementing IPRA. But they often lack the resources and the authority to actually enforce the law.
So they're set up to fail.
In many ways, yes. The NCIP needs more resources, more personnel, and stronger legal backing to do its job effectively.
It's about making sure they have the tools and the authority to hold violators of IPRA accountable.
Exactly. And along with strengthening the NCIP, we need to tackle corruption and political patronage. These issues are pervasive in government institutions in the Philippines.
How do these problems specifically affect indigenous communities?
Well, corruption can mean that resources and benefits that are meant for indigenous communities don't reach them. Political patronage can lead to unqualified people being appointed to positions of power within the NCIP or other relevant agencies. They're chosen because of their connections, not because they're competent or committed to serving indigenous peoples.
So it's not just about having laws in place, it's about making sure those laws are actually implemented fairly and transparently.
Yes, it's about creating a system that is truly accountable to the people it is meant to serve, and that includes indigenous peoples.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's talk about the role of the international community in supporting the rights of indigenous peoples in the Philippines. We know that the Philippines has signed international treaties like UNDRIP and participates in those UN human rights reviews. But what else can the international community do to make a real difference on the ground?
The international community can play a big role in several ways. First, international organizations and donor agencies can provide financial and technical support to those indigenous-led organizations and initiatives we were talking about. They can help with things like advocacy work, capacity building, and community development projects.
So, channeling resources directly to those who are doing the work on the ground.
Exactly. Second, the international community can help raise awareness about the issues facing indigenous peoples in the Philippines. They can do this by highlighting human rights violations, advocating for policy changes, and giving indigenous peoples a platform to speak on the global stage.
Giving them a voice and making sure their stories are heard.
Yes. And third, they can help monitor and hold the Philippine government accountable for its human rights obligations. That could involve conducting independent investigations, making public statements condemning violations, and supporting legal challenges against discriminatory policies and practices.
So, using their influence and leverage to pressure the government to actually uphold its commitments to indigenous people's rights.
Exactly. It's about making sure that the Philippines lives up to its international obligations and that indigenous peoples aren't left behind.
Now, let's talk about social injustice. Indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by poverty, lack of access to basic services, and systemic discrimination. What can be done to address these deep-rooted issues?
To address social injustice, you need a multifaceted approach that tackles both the symptoms and the root causes. One crucial area is investing in culturally appropriate education and healthcare for indigenous communities.
Can you give some more specifics? What would that look like?
It means supporting schools led by indigenous people that incorporate their languages, cultures, and traditional knowledge. It also means training healthcare professionals who are sensitive to the cultural beliefs and practices of indigenous peoples.
So, acknowledging that the typical one-size-fits-all approach to education and healthcare doesn't work for indigenous communities.
Right, exactly. It's about making sure that services are culturally relevant and accessible to everyone, regardless of their ethnicity or where they live.
What about the economic disparities? How do we create economic opportunities for indigenous communities that are sustainable?
Economic empowerment is key. One way to do that is to support economic initiatives that are led by indigenous peoples themselves. This could involve providing microloans, business training, and access to markets to help them develop businesses that benefit their communities.
Investing in their potential and creating a more level playing field?
Right. Another important aspect is promoting sustainable livelihoods that are based on indigenous knowledge and resource management practices.
Can you give us an example of what that might look like?
Many indigenous communities have a deep understanding of their local ecosystems. They've developed practices for managing resources like forests, fisheries, and agricultural lands that are actually very sustainable. Supporting these practices not only helps protect the environment, but it also creates economic opportunities for those communities.
So, recognizing the value of indigenous knowledge and incorporating it into development strategies.
Exactly. And it's about making sure that indigenous peoples benefit from any economic development that happens on their land.
Now, we talked earlier about the importance of data. Without data that's broken down by ethnicity, it's really difficult to understand the specific challenges that indigenous peoples face and to measure if programs and policies are actually working. How do we fix this lack of data?
We need to improve how we collect and analyze data. This means working with Indigenous communities to develop culturally sensitive data collection methods. And it means making sure that the data is broken down by ethnicity. That way we can actually track progress on the issues that matter to Indigenous peoples.
So moving beyond those general statistics that hide the disparities and unique challenges that different groups within society face.
Exactly. And then using that data to create policies that are evidence-based, targeted, and actually effective.
Data can be a powerful tool. Okay. Now let's go back to cultural preservation. The decision to get rid of mother tongue education was a big blow to Indigenous languages and cultures. What can be done to revitalize and protect these languages and make sure they're passed on to future generations?
Revitalizing Indigenous languages requires a multi-pronged approach. One key step is to support community-based language revitalization programs.
Can you give us an example of what that might look like?
Sure. These programs often involve things like creating language immersion schools, developing curriculum that's culturally relevant, and producing materials to help people learn the language. They might also involve documenting and archiving languages that are in danger of disappearing.
So investing in the future of these languages and acknowledging their importance.
Yes. Another crucial aspect is empowering Indigenous educators. Give them the training, resources, and support they need to teach their languages and cultures in their communities.
So recognizing the expertise that exists within Indigenous communities and giving them a platform to share that knowledge.
Exactly. And finally, it's important to create spaces where Indigenous languages and cultures can thrive.
What do you mean by that?
This could involve supporting Indigenous media, setting up cultural centers, or promoting Indigenous arts and crafts. It's about creating environments where these languages and cultures are valued and celebrated, and where they can be passed on to future generations.
Now, besides revitalizing languages, what can be done to address cultural preservation more broadly?
Another crucial part of cultural preservation is addressing the legacy of past injustices. That means returning stolen lands, getting back cultural artifacts that were taken, and providing reparations for the harms done to Indigenous peoples during colonization.
So acknowledging those wrongs and taking action to repair the damage.
Yes. And recognizing that colonization still has an impact today, and that Indigenous peoples continue to face systemic discrimination.
Okay. We've talked a lot about the need to shift power and build genuine partnerships with Indigenous communities. What role can the media play in all of this? How can they shape public perception and support Indigenous people's rights in the Philippines?
The media plays a huge role. Unfortunately, Indigenous communities are often portrayed in very stereotypical and misleading ways. We need more responsible and accurate media representation. The media should highlight the diversity, resilience, and contributions of Indigenous peoples.
So changing the narrative and challenging those harmful stereotypes.
Exactly. And amplifying Indigenous voices and perspectives. Let them tell their own stories, share their knowledge, and advocate for their rights. Don't speak for them.
We've discussed a lot of potential solutions, but we have to remember that none of this will be successful if we don't address the root of the problem, which is the systemic discrimination and marginalization that Indigenous peoples continue to face.
You're absolutely right. We can't just make small changes around the edges. We need to change the systems and structures that create inequality and injustice.
That means a fundamental shift in attitudes and beliefs. We have to recognize the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples and commit to building a society where they can live with dignity, security, and self-determination.
It's a big goal, but I don't think it's impossible. If we work together, listen to Indigenous voices, and take a holistic and equitable approach to development, we can create a future where Indigenous peoples in the Philippines not only survive, but thrive.
It's a future worth fighting for. Now, before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, where we'll look at specific examples of Indigenous-led initiatives in action, what are some things our listeners can do to contribute to this movement for change?
There are many ways to get involved, even if you're not directly involved in policymaking or activism. The first thing you can do is educate yourself about the issues. Read the reports and articles you've shared with us, look for information from Indigenous-led organizations, and really listen to the stories and experiences of Indigenous peoples.
So learning more, understanding the issues, and challenging our own biases.
Right. And then you can start spreading awareness. Talk to your friends and family, share information on social media, write to your elected officials, and advocate for policies that support Indigenous people's rights.
So using our own platforms to raise awareness and encourage action.
Yes. You can also support indigenous-led organizations working on the ground. There are so many groups doing amazing work to protect their lands and cultures. You can donate to these organizations, volunteer your time, or just help spread the word about the work they do.
So putting our words into action and supporting those who are on the front lines of this struggle for justice and equality.
Exactly. And finally, think about the choices you make as a consumer. Support businesses that operate ethically and sustainably, especially those that respect Indigenous people's rights and benefit their communities.
So using our purchasing power to make a difference.
Yes. Remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. But every step we take towards a more just and equitable world for Indigenous peoples is a step in the right direction.
We've discussed the challenges, we've explored potential solutions, and now it's time to see how these solutions are actually being implemented. Join us in the final part of our deep dive as we delve into some specific examples of Indigenous-led initiatives that are making a real difference in the Philippines.
These stories of resilience, innovation, and hope will give you a glimpse into the future we're all striving for, a future where the rights of Indigenous peoples are fully realized and their cultures can flourish.
Until then, keep diving deep. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Indigenous peoples' rights in the Philippines. We've spent the last two parts talking about the challenges, exploring some solutions, and really focusing on the importance of initiatives led by Indigenous communities themselves. Now we're going to look at some specific examples of these initiatives in action, showing just how resilient and creative these communities are across the Philippines.
These stories are really powerful. They challenge the often pretty negative realities we've been talking about and show that change is possible. In fact, change is already happening, and it's being driven by Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, it's easy to get bogged down by the challenges, but it's important to highlight the successes, the stories that show us a path toward a more just and fair future.
Right. A great example is the Tagbanua community in Coron, Palawan. They've been working really hard to protect their ancestral lands and their cultural heritage. They're facing a lot of pressure from tourism development, but they've taken a really proactive approach to managing their resources in a sustainable way, a way that benefits their community and the environment.
We hear a lot about the negative impacts of tourism, especially for Indigenous communities. They're often displaced or pushed aside by those big developments. So how has the Tagbanua community dealt with this challenge?
Well, they've recognized that tourism can be a good thing, if it's managed properly. It can create economic opportunities. But they've been very clear that they need to be in control. They need to manage their lands and resources, and they need to make sure that any development aligns with their cultural values and traditional practices.
So not rejecting tourism completely, but shaping it to benefit the community and preserve their heritage. How have they done that?
They've created some community-based ecotourism initiatives that allow visitors to experience the beauty of their ancestral domain, but in a way that's respectful of their culture and traditions. They have guidelines for tour operators, they limit the number of visitors, they don't allow certain activities in sacred sites, and they make sure that a good portion of the money stays within the community.
It's all about finding that balance, right? Balancing economic development with protecting your culture. It sounds like the Tagbanua community is doing a really amazing job of leading the way.
They are. Their approach is a model for others. They're showing how to do tourism responsibly, putting the community and the environment first. And it really shows how resilient they are, how they're able to take their traditional knowledge and adapt it to the challenges of today's world.
It's really inspiring to see these communities taking charge of their future. Now let's talk about another Indigenous-led initiative that's been getting attention, the Ifugão's work to revitalize their traditional rice terraces in Banaue. These terraces are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They're stunning and a testament to the ingenuity of their ancestors, but they're also a crucial source of livelihood for the Ifugao people.
The Ifugao rice terraces are incredible. They're a symbol of the Ifugao people's identity. But in recent decades, they've faced a number of challenges. People moving away, changing farming methods, and the effects of climate change.
It sounds like a situation where cultural heritage is under threat from both internal and external pressures. How have the Ifugao people responded to these challenges?
They've realized that preserving the rice terraces isn't just about their cultural significance, it's also about their economic and ecological value. So they've been doing a lot to revitalize the terraces, promote sustainable farming practices, and encourage younger generations to stay or return to the land.
What are some of the strategies they've used?
They've organized community work groups to repair and maintain the terraces. This has helped to revive traditional knowledge about water management and how to grow rice. They've also created cooperatives to market their rice and other agricultural products, making sure farmers get fair prices. And they've been actively advocating for government support and policies that promote sustainable agriculture and protect cultural heritage.
So it's a holistic approach that combines practicality with cultural sensitivity. What's been the outcome of their efforts so far?
They've seen some really positive results. The Ifugo people are feeling a renewed sense of pride in their heritage. The terraces are attracting tourists again, which brings income to the community. And maybe even more importantly, they're inspiring other indigenous communities across the Philippines. They're showing them that it's possible to reclaim their ancestral lands and revitalize their traditions.
It's a reminder that cultural heritage isn't just about the past, it's about the future. It's about preserving knowledge and ways of life that can contribute to sustainable development. Now, before we wrap up, what have we learned from these stories? What are the key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the most important takeaway is that indigenous peoples aren't just waiting for someone else to fix things. They're taking action. They're agents of change. They have the knowledge, the resilience, and the drive to create a better future.
It's about recognizing their agency, right? Empowering them to take the lead.
Exactly. We need to support their efforts, amplify their voices, and learn from their wisdom. Indigenous peoples have a deep understanding of the environment. They've developed sustainable practices that have worked for generations. Their knowledge is incredibly valuable, especially now as we face global challenges like climate change and inequality.
It's a call to action. Stand with Indigenous peoples, learn from them, and work together to create a world that's fairer and more sustainable for everyone. We've covered a lot in this deep dive. We talked about the complex challenges facing Indigenous peoples in the Philippines, explored some potential solutions, and highlighted the incredible work being done by Indigenous-led initiatives. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with a feeling of hope. The challenges are real, but there are also stories of strength, creativity, and determination that show us a path forward.
The fight for the rights of indigenous peoples is a fight for all of us. It's a fight for a world where everyone is respected, where everyone has a voice, and where everyone can live with dignity.
And that's a fight worth having. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We encourage you to continue learning, listening, and engaging with these issues. Remember, even small actions can make a difference. Support organizations led by Indigenous peoples, advocate for change, and be mindful of your choices as a consumer. Together, we can build a world where Indigenous peoples' rights are not only recognized but fully realized. Until next time, keep diving deep.